Hi all, welcome to part 2 in this video presentation series as part of the Altis Need for Speed course. Let's now have a quick look at what this presentation consists of. In part 1 of the presentation series, I discussed and evidenced why considering technical features in isolation is potentially flawed, and that it's highly unlikely that you'll find a single technical feature which is consistently related to performance with athletes. And in this second part of the presentation series, we'll take this further and look at associations between combinations of technical features and how they collectively relate to initial sprint performance, before going on to describe the methods I use to measure and portray individual strategies. At the end of part 1 of this presentation series, I showed data from a study which showed a general linear relationship between toe-off distance and sprint performance over the initial steps within 3 different athlete groups. That is, sprint performance was typically greater with a foot position more posterior relative to the centre of mass at toe-off. As explained though, there were a number of athletes who were particularly fast who did not achieve a position with their foot that was that far behind them in relation relative to the center of mass in relation to other players who are much slower. So I wanted to investigate this further. Firstly, I ran the same analysis with a different larger cohort of male professional rugby players, and also with a cohort of male professional football players, and also with international female lacrosse players. Now, the same relationships of this technical feature in sprint performance were not found in these groups, which confirmed some of my reservations about advocating this technical feature in isolation. So I began to try and figure out why it is that people were able to achieve the same sprint performance with different magnitudes of toe-off distance. What was apparent to me was that achieving high performance was possible with differing toe-off distances depending on what was happening with regards to the player's contact times. So if you have a look at the figure on the slide now, here I have plotted the toe-off distances against the contact times of rugby backs. Variables have been normalized here to factor out again the influencing effect of leg length. Now, the red data points represent the first 4 fastest athletes over the first 4 steps. And also this corresponded to the fastest athletes over 5 meters, and then although not in the same rank order, these athletes were still the fastest 4 out of the group over 10 meters as well. So let's consider the fastest player on the left-hand side, and just to highlight, so there's only one other player with shorter ground contact time than him, which you can see by the single data point to the left of the dotted red line. However, there are lots of players who achieved a foot position more posterior relative to their center of mass. So the more negative the value on the vertical axis is here, the more posterior the player's foot position is relative to the center of mass at toe-off. And you can see the number of data points there are below this player. Then if you look at the player in second place, looking to the right of the dotted red line, you can see that only 3 other players produce longer contact times compared with this player, yet that player achieved the most posterior position of their foot relative to the center of mass at toe-off. If you look below the dotted red line, for example, you can see no other data points. And then the player ranked third has a similar strategy to the player ranked first, and the player in 4th place had a similar strategy to the player ranked second. So what we can see here is that it's possible to achieve high levels of sprint performance by not achieving the long elongated position at toe-off with your foot far behind your center of mass, provided your contact times are short, like the player ranked first in this figure. And in fact, different combinations of the magnitude in toe-off distance and ground contact time can result in the same sprint performance. What we can't have though is a small distance between the foot and the center of mass at toe-off and a long contact time during that step. And so looking at combinations of variables start to tell us a bit more about individual strategies And in the research that I've carried out when looking at combination of normalized variables in different regression models, the picture becomes a little clearer. So contact time and toe-off distance are not repeatedly related to initial sprint acceleration performance in isolation, but when combined, they do predict a meaningful variation in performance relatively consistently. So looking at the table here, we can see that the multiple R value is reasonable. So this shows the relationship between the combination of the variables in that first column with initial sprint acceleration performance. The adjusted R squared value tells us of the effect of this relationship. And then the final column shows that within this cohort of rugby backs that these combined variables predicted 35% of the variation in sprint acceleration performance. So how variables may combine to produce proficient sprint acceleration performance is an important concept to grasp, and how one variable may influence another is also an important consideration. So we can see that there is clearly a relationship between toe-off distance and contact time in the figure, which makes sense because to the the center of mass has to spend longer time moving forward relative to the contact foot in order to increase the horizontal distance between these points. But if it takes too long to do so, if we take too long to get to this long toe-off position, then acceleration may decrease because your opponent's going to be into the next step before you've finished your one. Another example of where the combination of technical features may be important to sprint acceleration performance is on the slide now. So some of the other regression analysis that I've undertaken has looked at hip extension angular velocity at the instant of touchdown combined with measures of ankle dorsiflexion range. I'm going to cover the interplay between these technical features in more detail in part 4 of this presentation series. But in short, it is theorized that an active touchdown, so one which increases the hip extension velocity at touchdown, is likely to produce a more forceful hip extensor moment to propel the center of mass forward during the stance phase. However, it is unlikely that an increase in hip extension angular velocity will result in greater acceleration of the center of mass during the stance phase unless the stance ankle is able to remain relatively stiff in order to transmit the energy from the hip extensors as effective horizontal ground reaction force. So I looked at a number of combinations for these technical features and found, as shown in the table, that performance is significantly related to the combination of hip extension angular velocity at touchdown combined with peak ankle dorsiflexion during the stance phase. It is a relatively small effect, but still predicted 22% in the variation of performance over the first 4 steps. To help illustrate what an active touchdown looks like, I'm going to play a video in the top right corner of the screen now, and here you'll be able to see the first athlete with limited hip extension angular velocity at touchdown. And in fact, you can see quite a lot of knee extension going on in the late swing phase and not a great deal of hip extension. So they do not have a touchdown that is particularly active. They tend to hit down more rather than hitting back and down, which may be a more useful strategy during the initial steps. The second athlete then will be shown to have much more in the way of an active hip extension in the late swing phase relative to the amount of knee extension, and this would be said to be a more active touchdown. So I'm just going to play the video twice now and see if you can see the differences between the two athletes. Now, in relation to the ankle during the stance phase, I mentioned that having a relatively, in inverted commas, stiff ankle is important here, which it is, but we don't want an ankle that's so stiff that our contact times are really short, which leads to us popping up in the air before our center of mass has passed a reasonable distance beyond our base of support before extending our leg. So in this video, I show 3 athletes depicting really a continuum of stiffness-like qualities at the ankle. The second athlete demonstrates large amounts of ankle dorsiflexion, which in my opinion in this example for this athlete it is too much, whereas the third athlete shows the opposite, quite a limited amount of dorsiflexion, which pops them up off the ground too soon during these initial steps. The first athlete though probably presents a happy medium with moderate ankle dorsiflexion and a nice stable foot position to transmit the force from the hip extensors to the ground. So I'm going to play this video now. Although looking at the combination of technical features might tell us a little bit more about how we organize our bodies to sprint fast during the initial steps, really in the grand scheme of things, the amount of variation in sprint performance that the coupled variables are predicting is not that high. And in total, I've investigated relationships of, it's about 52 different technical variables now with 4 different sprint performance measures, including horizontal power over a set number of steps during initial acceleration, step velocity over the same number of steps, time to 5 and 10 meters, and an acceleration of the center of mass over the same distances. And there are no single variables alone that are repeatedly related to initial sprint acceleration performance. And in terms of the combination of technical variables, there's over about 20 different combinations that I've looked at. And yes, while some of them can explain a reasonable amount of the variation in sprint performance, the magnitude of that variation does vary from athlete to athlete groups to different athlete groups. It's not always that consistent, and athletes tend to still be able to sprint with different combinations of those variables to produce proficient sprint acceleration performance. And I think looking at technical features this way and their relationships with sprint performance, as I've already explained, is a bit flawed, and it's perhaps somewhat reductionist. Now, they do help to provide some insight, so I'm not saying that information isn't worthwhile, because it is. But really, this is applying methodological reductionism to try and explain something that is a bit all more encompassing. And I quite like this definition on the screen now, and apologies to whoever came up with this definition that I haven't credited them for it, but I'm not sure where I found it. So what can we do about this then? What does it all mean, and where does this leave us? Well, for me, what it means is that we should then try to use a more whole body approach to give us a fuller picture at a more macroscopic level of an athlete's sprint acceleration strategy. Something more all-encompassing than a number of discrete technical features that we think can aggregate up to a precise universal technical model which corresponds to proficient sprint performance. So in order to do this then, we could look at measures which cater for the entire movement across every time point in the movement. And this provides us with a more complete description of the technique and coordination of the movement. However, there would be an infinite number of variables we could look at, and the vast data needing to be processed and then assimilated means that we can't turn this data around into actionable information in a timely manner. And within most sports settings, that's obviously quite important. So I use an approach which combines spatial temporal variables together in their dimensionless form to depict the outcome of the interaction between linear and angular kinematics and kinetic factors underpinning sprinting, whilst also correcting for the effect of stature. So we're going to go on to have a look at this method of trying to characterize individual sprint acceleration strategies now. So I have collected and analyzed the spatial temporal variables of athletes through video images pretty consistently for the best part of more than 15 years now, and I've settled on a non-invasive approach where I can turn data around pretty quickly. And to do this, I collect high-speed video data at 240 frames per second and record several sprint efforts for athletes who are sprinting with maximal intent and with no thought about technique, so that they're sprinting in their natural way. Then the videos are then uploaded to analysis software where I can obtain the spatial temporal step characteristics, so the step length, step rate, contact time and flight times. So as part of my PhD research and the applied work that I've done, I set out to see if I could classify groups of team sport athletes according to the combination of their normalized spatial temporal variables. So by factoring all 4 spatial temporal variables together, so their step length, step rate, contact time and flight time, this means I can get a single measure or a single representation of an athlete's strategy. And this combination of normalized spatial temporal variables depicts the outcome, as I've already explained, of the interaction between linear and angular kinematics and kinetic factors underpinning sprinting. And when I say normalized here, I use an equation from Hoff's paper on scaling gait to body size, which effectively removes the influence of stature and therefore having a longer leg. So to try and figure out whether athletes could be grouped into a number of different strategies or whether there is just one large continuum of strategies, I ran some cluster analysis on rugby backs initially, whereby I looked at their normalized spatial temporal variables over the first 4 steps of a sprint to depict the initial sprint acceleration phase. And the cluster analysis revealed that broadly, players could be grouped into 4 different types. And this cluster analysis is shown on the left-hand side now of the slide, where you can see what is known as a dendrogram. So without going into too much detail here, the 4 normalized spatial temporal variables of step length, step rate, contact time and flight time are entered into the analysis, and players are grouped according to the magnitudes of these variables, so how similar those variables are. And in the dendrogram you can see group A on the left hand side. So these players are represented as this orange color. Then group B you can see next, group C, and then group D. Now this is great because it helps us categorize these different groups of team sport athletes according to the combination of their normalized spatial temporal variables. But the issue with this though is that you do not get a real sense of how each player compares to one another within the group or between the groups, and also the distribution of the variables between players and groups. So in an attempt to provide a single overall view of strategies that can be actually quantified for measurement purposes, I validated an approach against this cluster analysis, whereby I look at the ratios of the step length to step rate and contact time to flight time and plot them on a scatter plot as Z-scores. And here you can see that the groups identified from the cluster analysis as I guess a lower resolution version on the right hand side within this quadrant, or within the 4 quadrants. Now the size of each marker represents the sprinting performance here, where larger markers depict a faster athlete. And what we see is that no one strategy is any faster than any others. So what we're seeing here is an illustration of inter-athlete degeneracy, which essentially means that different athletes can achieve the same outcome in sprint acceleration through different strategies. which would also explain why it's quite difficult to try and pin down some discrete technical features in terms of how, in terms of their meaningful relationships consistently with sprint acceleration performance. If each quadrant represents a different strategy, let's look at the different strategies and figure out what they mean. So as I play the video on the screen, I will talk through the different strategies and just focus on the athletes that I'm referring to and ignore the other three when I'm talking through the different strategies. So in region A, which is in the bottom right hand quadrant, here we can see athletes who will have relatively longer contact times and relatively shorter flight times during their steps. So they like to spend a high proportion of their time compared to the other regions, or some of the other regions, during the step cycle in contact with the ground. They also have a higher step rate relative to the magnitude of their step length, so they would be considered step rate preferent. Then in region B, so in the bottom left corner of the quadrant, the player's strategy here is the same with regards to being step rate preference, but their contact times are relatively short compared with the length of their flight times. So typically they spend less time on the ground and prefer to be in the air more compared to region A. For quadrant C, so this time in the top right hand corner, players are step length preferent, so a higher step length relative to the magnitude of their step rate, and they also favour longer contact times and shorter flight times. Lastly, in region D, so in the top left, players are step length preferent, like in region C, but they typically produce shorter contact times and have a greater preference for spending time in the air. Now, not only were there no meaningful differences in the initial sprint acceleration performance of the rugby backs according to their normalized spatial temporal variables, or the combination of those on the previous slides, the same was also found amongst sprinters, rugby sevens players and professional football players too. Now, the long and short of this is that individuals have relatively unique strategies, and driving someone towards a one-size-fits-all, highly precise model might not be that appropriate. So one of the approaches that I take to help provide a bit of guidance for my more technical based interventions is to measure an athlete's individual strategy and how it corresponds to their performance across multiple sprint efforts to effectively figure out what they are doing when they are running at their fastest. That way, I may make the decision to try and shift them towards a certain strategy that seems to result in better performance for them. And this is what we're going to explore in part 3 of this presentation series. But for now, you can see on the screen the different strategies amongst the different athlete groups, and even within each group there's a fairly wide dispersion at different strategies that you can see. So it's not like one quadrant is dominated by a particular sport compared to the other athletes in the other sports.